There's a lot of your money that you are paying that you don't even know that's harming your lifestyle and our prosperity, all on behalf of climate change.
I am a husband, a father, a lawyer, a Christian, and a proud Canadian. I started this series because it was clear that our nation needs truth. Not just another biased narrative, but real information of substance. We need access to facts and the freedom to think for ourselves. I'm Leighton Gray, and this is Gray Matter.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Well, as you know, probably the foremost public policy issue, the one that dominates all of our federal government's policy right now, is climate change. And of course, there's a great divergence of opinion about climate change. Is it real? Is it fake? Are what we're being told, is it true? Is it false? And so, as you know, we talk a lot about this on the show. We've had Dr. Patrick Moore on the show to talk about his books. We've talked about people like Bjorn Lomborg, Michael Schellenberger, and Alex Epstein. So I thought it would be great to have someone on the show who is an American author who's just written a great new book. It's called Climate and Energy Lies: Expensive, Dangerous, and Destructive. His name is Frank Lasee. Welcome to the program, Frank. Thanks for being on the program today to talk about your book.
Hey, thanks for having me on. And you're absolutely correct. This is one of the most important topics out there. And really, it could be the most important topic because energy and food supply and having abundant, reliable, affordable energy, and then also a good, solid food supply are important to modern life, important to the 8 billion people on Earth. It's important to each and every one of us. And it affects economic policy in a whole lot of ways, because when our energy costs are expensive and spiking and continuing to rise, contrary to the lies that they've been telling us that somehow wind and solar would lower our electric rates and become cheaper. In fact, everywhere in the world where they add more of them, they become far more expensive. Denmark, Germany, and the United Kingdom all are farther along the path in wind and solar, and the people there pay triple the electric rates we pay now here in the US, the average electric rate, and they are continuing to climb. And when you're spending more money on energy or on food, as we've all experienced the food inflation lately, last few years, you have less to spend on everything else. So everything else suffers as well. And then the people who work in those industries suffer, and it creates a negative spiral in the economy.
Yeah, this is so true. And of course, in Canada, we have something called a climate tax, even though we produce less than 1% of all the carbon emissions. But before we get into introducing you properly and dive in, as we always do, we have a few framing aphorisms. So the first is from someone who has really become more famous for climatology and climate scare than his political career, and that's Al Gore. He said, "I think the cost of energy will come down when we make this transition to renewable energy." Of course, we already know that that's false. Leonardo DiCaprio, the famous actor who once starred in a movie in Banff, Canada, and actually flew every day on his private jet back to California each night during shooting. He was so concerned about climate. He said, "I play fictitious characters, often solving fictitious problems. I believe mankind has looked at climate change in the same way, as if it were a fiction." And of course, Greta Thunberg, dear Greta, who said, "A top climate scientist is warning that climate change will wipe out all of humanity unless we stop using fossil fuels over the next 5 years. And of course, the internet is is eternal. That was posted on June 21st, 2018. Well, and finally, we have the Dr. Patrick Moore, who says, "Today we live in an unusually cold period in the history of life on Earth, and there's no reason to believe that a warmer climate would be anything but beneficial for humans and the majority of other species." That's Dr. Patrick Moore, one of the founders of Greenpeace. Who do we have on the show today? Well, Frank Lasee. He served Wisconsin as a state senator and in Governor Scott Walker's administration. The district he represented had a lot of electricity generation: coal, natural gas, 2 nuclear plants, biodigesters, wind towers, and now a solar plant. Frank is an expert on energy and environmental issues. His articles have appeared in the Washington Examiner, the Washington Post, Real Clear Energy, The Hill, and others. and he has been a guest on TV and radio news. He has spoken to more than 15,000 people in large and small groups. And of course, you can find more of his work in addition to here at his website, which is truthinenergyandclimate.com. So, Frank, we want to talk about your book, but before we go there, I want to read something to you. That's kind of funny. Well, not funny, haha, but funny in the sense that what we're talking about. This is a piece that says that the Arctic Ocean is warming up, icebergs are growing scarcer, and in some places the seals are finding the water too hot, according to a report to the Commerce Department yesterday from U.S. Consulate at Bergen, Norway. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers all point to a radical change in climate conditions and hitherto unheard of temperatures in the Arctic zone. Exploration expeditions report that scarcely any ice has been met as far north as 81 degrees 29 minutes. And soundings to a depth of 3,100 meters show the Gulf Stream still very warm. Great masses of ice have been replaced by moraines of earth and stones, the report continued, while at many points well-known glaciers have entirely disappeared. Very few seals and no whitefish are found in the eastern Arctic, while vast shoals of herring and smelts, which have never before ventured so far north, are being encountered in the old seal fishing grounds. Within a few years, it is predicted that due to the ice melt, the sea will rise and make most coast cities uninhabitable. That was published on November 2nd, 1922 in the Washington Post. So, Frank, what is going on? Why are we being, what's the truth about climate change? What's the truth that you talk about in your book?
Well, and it's interesting. I was smiling while you were reading that because I figured the punchline was that this was from the 1920s or 30s. It's all cyclical, and we have been warming out of the little ice age from about 1350 to 1850. It was much cooler then, and cold times are worse for weather, and they are worse for growing crops, and people have famine and die. And you're pointing out by reading that article that this has happened before in the Arctic. And in fact, the Earth warming out of the little ice age from 1850, also known more romantically as pre-industrial times, that the climate alarmists like to use, because I think it's hard to sell us that if we're a few degrees warmer than the little ice age, that's somehow a bad thing. And that's part of these lies that are just told to us and the propaganda that we get continuously. And in fact, the temperature records are pretty clear, and we have very sketchy worldwide temperature records prior to about 1960. So when they start telling you that we know precisely what the temperature was back in 1880, 1920 worldwide, we certainly don't. And even today, it's questionable, even with 60,000 stations around the Earth for one temperature global that isn't showing much warming at all, that we don't really have accurate records. And in fact, NOAA and NASA are cooking the record books. They've gone back and adjusted away the cooling period from about 1940 to 1979. It was cooling. The internet doesn't forget. There are articles from that time showing graphs, and I have those in my book, Climate and Energy Lies, showing graphs that we had a definite cooling period. That's why some of us remember the 1970s when Leonard Nimoy did a special on the coming ice age.
I just watched it, yeah.
Yeah, and the coming ice age is, it's a good film. You should watch it. The coming ice age was going to freeze all of us, and then a decade later, it's global warming, and now it's climate change. And the reason I think they went to climate change is it just might start cooling. And if it does, weather will get worse. So they're emphasizing, weather events. The Earth is a big place. We've always had weather events, always will have weather events. And it's covered very in depth in my book that nowhere where they're telling us that hurricanes are increasing. We just went through that with a couple hurricanes that hit Florida and North Carolina, that somehow this is unprecedented. It's happening and it's getting worse. And actually, we just went through a decade, 11 years with no landfalling hurricanes at all in the United States. That's unusual. That just happened. But forget the facts. Forget the facts that there were 24 hurricanes during the decade of the 1940s to the 1950s, the 1940s, 24 landfalling hurricanes, and 10 Category 5 hurricanes hitting the United States in that decade. That was the most active for hurricanes, and that was before CO2 started to become a problem. So we're told a lot of things that simply aren't true. And that's what my book exposes them. And there's a lot of unsaid lies as well, such as, if we limit or somehow stop CO2 from going in the atmosphere, that the weather will get better. It's one of those hidden lies that said that somehow the weather will stop. Well, no, it won't, no matter what. We're always going to have weather events. So we're rife with these, and they're being used for a purpose to drive some very expensive, harmful, destructive energy policies.
In reading your book, which I found fascinating, your point seems to be that climate change policy is more dangerous than climate change itself. And sort of putting your book in the context of some others that I've read, for example, Bjorn Lomborg, who thinks that that CO2 and climate change is a problem, but it's one that is quite manageable through the proper application of technology. Now, you don't appear to be in that camp. You seem to be more in the camp of Dr. Patrick Moore, who basically says that really all of the climate change propaganda is false and lies. Is that a fair assessment, or are you sort of somewhere in between those two camps?
No, I'm very much with Patrick Moore, in that more CO2 is good. It's necessary plant food. It's also necessary for our lives. Humans inhale CO2. If you put someone in a room with no CO2 at all, they would die. They would die. If we get below 200 parts per million, about half of where we are right now, plant matter would all die in the world, and so would we, because we'd have nothing to eat. So they've demonized something that is odorless, colorless, and it puts in soda, we call it soda here in Wisconsin, or pop, puts the carbonation in. We know what carbonation is. It makes the beer sparkle, champagne sparkle. There's nothing to fear with it, and more of it. They add it to greenhouses because it is airborne Miracle-Gro, and it really enhances plant growth a lot. NASA has pointed out, and they've done studies, that the world is about 30% greener over the last 40 years. And they attribute 70% of that to the more CO2 in the atmosphere. The Earth is greening, and that's a good thing. The deserts are actually receding, but those are hard to find because it doesn't fit the narrative. So they don't want any facts getting out that don't fit the narrative. I've been censored from LinkedIn showing long-term 450 million year graphs of the ice cores that show no relationship whatsoever between CO2 and temperature. In fact, sometimes they're going in opposite directions. And when you look at more recent, the last 100,000 years of ice records, they take ice cores from Antarctica and from the very 2-mile deep ice in Greenland, and they analyze it closely. They found that CO2 actually lags temperature by 600 to 800 years. So how can something that lags temperature lead temperature? It really doesn't make sense when you start examining the underlying parts of the climate change. And the other big thing is most people far overestimate how much CO2 is in the atmosphere because it's a very tiny trace gas. And most people don't know that water vapor is the dominant greenhouse gas. It's 50 times more abundant than CO2. It's 11,000 times more abundant than methane, one of their other targets. And it's 60,000 times more abundant than nitrous oxide. And both methane and nitrous oxide are now tools of the climate change agenda to attack our food supply and try to limit our food supply. And they've been telling us for years that, people are going to die and we can't support 8 billion people on Earth. And that's part of the agenda, is to literally kill off billions of people of the climate agenda. And you can say, well, Frank, that's just conspiracy theory. And 5 or 10 years ago, the things I'm telling people now would have seemed very, very much a conspiracy theory. But you know what? They actually have it in their documents, the World Economic Forum, the UN, the Club for Rome, that they're using climate change as a tool to get their control agenda on people, unsuspecting people. Because if we had knowledge of this area and hadn't been propagandized, most people wouldn't accept what they're trying to do to us.
In Michael Schellenberger's book, Apocalypse Never, he makes the point that in the first part of this century, more people were raised out of poverty than throughout all of human history, and this was done mainly through energy production and advances in technology and food production. But that a lot of that advancement was sort of undone by COVID. And you make this point now that the suppression of energy production seems to be linked to these globalist policy, which include, depopulation of 7/8 of the Earth, And this idea that there's some connection between suppression of energy and massive government technocratic control. Am I getting off the mark, or is there an actual connection there?
It is being used by the global socialist communists, the globalists, the UN, and particularly the United Nations, to further their power and their gains. And it's telling that the executive director of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, is a socialist. He is a member of the Socialist Party. He was elected as a socialist in Portugal. They are using this for a control issue. And it's very expensive for all of us. And warming is actually beneficial to everyone in the earth, and the earth is getting greener. These are good things. Worldwide crop harvests and yields are up dramatically. And corn in the, excuse me again, corn in the United States is really a great example. Corn loves CO2, and the increase in harvests and yields, how much comes from each acre, is just unbelievable in the corn area. It's not at all attributable to CO2. We have better seeds, we have herbicides, pesticides, fertilizers. Fertilizers are derived from natural gas, a fossil fuel, something they want to limit. But we've gone from yields, how much comes from an acre of land in the United States for corn, from 28 bushels in 1900 to 198 bushels today. And it continues to grow. And we are growing so much corn in the United States that we put 1/3 of it in our gas tanks. And it's hardly a drop in the bucket as to how much oil and gas we actually use. But it goes to the fact that we have plenty of food. Really, famines are caused in local areas with bad weather. That's always happened, always will. And then the political aspect of not being able to get food to those people. And they're attacking both our energy supply, trying to make it shorter and more expensive and more unreliable, and our food supply by trying to regulate methane and nitrous oxide, which don't need to be. They're tiny, tiny, minuscule parts of the atmosphere, and they're not going to double for 270 years at present rates of increase. And they'll still be teeny tiny parts of the atmosphere. There's no scientific basis whatsoever to regulate and try to contain methane and nitrous oxide. It is a tool to make food more expensive and to get us to switch off meat. They don't like meat. They want us to eat bugs instead or become vegans. And there's proof of that as well. There's an organization connected with the WEF, World Economic Forum, and the UN, C40 cities, about 17 US cities are members. The mayors signed them up, so there's no vote of the city council. There are about 100 cities in the world. And their aspirations, when they're called out on it, it's hard to find. They may have taken it down, but I have pictures. I have proof that their aspirations for their cities, if you're a C40 city like New York or Houston, is to turn their citizens vegan or as close as they can to vegan, to eliminate car use and have car ownership gone, to limit people to 3 clothes purchases a year, 3 outfits a year, which many men might like, but I think the women won't. And they also want to limit people to 1 plane flight every 4 years. This is their agenda. This is what they are working towards. And you can say, well, Frank, what does that really mean? What are they going to do with that? How does that happen? Well, New York City, for instance, has control over what they feed their prisoners, what they feed their students. And they also have control over what is served in things owned by the city. They are moving towards a vegan diet. They did this at the Paris Olympics this year, where they told us it was the greenest ever. So they tried to give the athletes a largely vegan diet, and they rebelled. They said, no, we need meat and eggs to fuel our bodies so that we can really perform well here. They also said, air conditioning is bad for climate too. So this gives you some of their agenda. We're not going to have air conditioning here. And again, the athletes said, Paris is hot in the summer. It always is, has been. We're bringing our own air conditioning. Thank you very much. They had them sleep on cardboard beds for the climate. I mean, this is how insidious and how much they want to control each and every one of us, all for the climate. When in fact, they're cooking the climate books. They're going back and adjusting the historical temperatures. They have cooled the past and they're warming the post-2008 temperatures to sell us this climate warming. When in fact it's good. Longer growing seasons are good. Growing for crops further north into Canada is good for humanity, good for everyone. But yet they turn it all on its head and tell us that it's just the opposite.
It's very bad for people in the United States and Canada But you make the point in the book that it's even worse for people in other parts of the world who do not have the same access to energy or to food that we do. And really, these developing countries really want energy. They look at countries like Canada and the US, and they see that energy and the ability to have it in a cheap form is a key to prosperity and growth, and also to things like food production. But meanwhile, in places like Denmark, you posted out on your X page, Denmark is the first country in the world to introduce a carbon tax on cows and agriculture. It's hard to imagine Houston in Texas, sort of banning beef. But this is really happening. As you say, you use the word insidious, but there is a deeper agenda that's connected to depopulation, isn't there?
Yes, there absolutely is. And there are signs of this around the world. The largest bank in Australia now sends all of their credit card and debit card users, based on their purchases, a carbon, CO2. And by the way, calling CO2 carbon is like calling water hydrogen. It's simply dishonest. It's not true. But carbon, CO2 is odorless, and it's in our carbonation in our sodas and champagne. So hard to make people afraid of that. But if you call it carbon, to me, I think of charcoal, soot, dark, black, bad. So they market these things just like calling the Little Ice Age the pre-industrial times, when life was hard for 95% of the Americans, for everybody. Life was hard because you had to struggle, and we cut down trees around the world. Deforestation was terrible. It still is. In my book, I cover and have a picture of Haiti and Dominican Republic. They occupy halves of the Hispaniola island, and there's a night and day difference between the two of them, and it has everything to do with fuel. And in Dominican Republic, they have, and I've been to one, they have all-inclusive resorts. I'd recommend them. They're really great. A lot of people work there, so they support their families. Their kids can get educations. They can afford schools. They have other industries and vibrant cities there in the Dominican Republic. And Haiti is sunken into a failed state. People are leaving there, and we're importing them. We're paying to bring hundreds of thousands of them to the United States and give them money and status that they can stay. And they're fleeing a failed country that has literally cut down nearly every tree in their half of the island. And if you look at the pictures in my book, and you can find them on the web, you'll see that this is true. There's still 43% of the jungles and forests left in the Dominican Republic. And they have an enlightened policy in the Dominican Republic. They subsidize propane for poor people. So they make it cheap and affordable. And it's so much cleaner to heat your home and cook your food with propane than it is to burn wood. And if you were really concerned about CO2 and bad pollution, we'd be working around the world to move the 2 billion people who are dependent on dung and wood for fuel to propane, like they do in the Dominican Republic, because it preserves forests. Forests then grow back naturally. And that's another bit of good news that you'll never hear in the mainstream media, is that the greening of the earth has recreated forests, have regrown the size of France or Texas around the world naturally. And that the leaf mass that's been added on Earth just in the last 50 years equals this almost the size of the United States has increased.
Wow, remarkable.
So we are getting a better, greener world, a warmer world, but they're telling us again the upside down truth of it. They're also beta testing a CO2 tracking card in Sweden, so that everything you do, including eating and watching Netflix or using the internet, they're tracking all of your CO2, or they call it carbon. And that's a forerunner to provide, when things get expensive and short enough, food and energy. I think they want to put us on rations. There have been some of the climate crazed who have called to declare a climate emergency and go on wartime footing and ration energy and food. So they'll put a ration on us. They'll give us a ration card for carbon, CO2. And then when you meet, you use up all of yours. Wealthy people, Leonardo DiCaprio and Al Gore will just buy credits, so they'll continue on their merry way. It'll just be a little more expensive, but they have the wealth to pay for it, and they can continue their high carbon lifestyle. But you and I will be stuck at the end of the month, and that's why they also want global currency, CDC, or I'm sorry, I'm getting it wrong. digital currencies, because
Mhm.
digital currencies are programmable down to the person and the purchase. So
Right.
you couple that with a carbon card and a carbon ration, you get to the 25th of the month and you've used it all up, or you have a wedding like we just had for one of my daughters. So you have a lot more things you want to buy, but you just can't do it on your carbon ration. And then you can buy what they let you buy. You can't buy meat, but you can buy bugs. You can't buy beer, but you can buy whatever they want you to buy. And that's how insidious this is. That's where they eventually want to head. And then once they're there, then they'll just ratchet it down and ruin our lifestyles. And if
Mhm.
people knew this, we would never vote for this knowingly. But we're getting it forced upon us.
Mhm. Meanwhile, and you talk about in your book, some of the quote unquote green forms of energy production are not very green at all. For example, we saw recently with the hurricanes that went through Florida that these solar farms were ripped apart, causing massive, actually environmental damage. It's going to cost billions of dollars to clean all that up. And of course, solar doesn't produce very much energy compared to fossil fuels or nuclear. And you also posted out offshore wind is a killer of whale, dolphins, other mammals, fish, and lobsters, and they will not withstand powerful hurricanes. So really, these forms of energy that we're being sort of sold on, wind and solar, first of all, are not a reasonable, realistic alternative to fossil fuels. And more than that, they actually cause as much or more real environmental damage than using fossil fuels, don't they?
Well, that's absolutely correct. And all of them, we've been told that's another one of the lies, and it's discussed in my book more that, wind and solar are going to make our electric grids cheaper, less cost. They aren't. They're going to make them more expensive. The reason they make them more expensive, and that's part of what we do on our website, truthandenergyandclimate.com. We also have a weekly energy and climate newsletter to help expose the truth of these, is that they actually drive up the costs of our electricity. And it's worse than that. It's more insidious than that. In the big picture of things, all the money we're spending on subsidies for wind and solar is borrowed money, adding to our $35 trillion national debt, adding to our $1 trillion national interest payments. And then we're purchasing 80% of that from China. China's the low cost producer, and they always will be. And big reason China is the low cost producer is they get 56% of all their energy from coal. They use more than half of the 8.5 billion tons of coal used every year. So China is building our wind and solar infrastructure. They're our political rival in the world. They are a totalitarian regime. They are building their military very strong. They have bad intentions. They're a proven bully of other nations to get what they want. They steal trades, patents. They do a lot of bad acting in the world. And if they become the dominant country in the world, we are in rough shape. So we're feeding the Chinese machine while adding to our national debt, while making our electricity more expensive. And the government subsidies, if we ended, and we've had about 40 years of government subsidies for wind and solar, if we ended them, they would die on the vine immediately because they're even more expensive, even with a 30% subsidy to build and a 30% subsidy for all the electricity they generate. So they're getting huge amounts of it. It's like if the government paid a third of the cost of you building your home and then paid a third of your mortgage. It's ridiculous that we're wasting this kind of money on these programs, not to mention the literal trillions of dollars it's going to cost to build very expensive high transmission wires for all that wind and solar that's out in rural areas and bring it to the cities.
Mhm.
That all adds a lot of cost to our electric grid. And it doesn't even really lower our CO2 footprint very much at all, because the dirty secret is if we want to have electricity all the time, which we all do, we take it for granted in the US, except for maybe Californians and Texans, who all both have very high penetrations of wind and solar, by the way. You can't have a reliable grid without keeping enough coal, natural gas, and nuclear power on the grid running all the time, because you can't turn those off and on when the sun sets or the wind stops blowing, which is frequently. And therefore, you keep them running in what's the industry calls spinning reserve. To help people, regular people understand it, it's like you have your gas car and someone says, hey, buy this car that only works when the solar panels collect electricity. because you want to put gas in it so it'll be free. And you buy it, and the government pays 30% of the cost of it. And then you get it, and you go, well, I can't give up my gas car because I can't go to work in the morning and come back after dark. Or if it starts raining, my electric car doesn't work. And then you buy a solar car, and you add that too. Or an electric, a wind-powered car as well, and you add that too. Same problem. You can't even take it to your kid's soccer game because it might stop blowing, wind stop blowing at the end of the game. So you now, and you have to keep the analogy the same. You have to keep your gas car idling all the time. You have to keep it running all the time because you have to jump in to go rescue one of your other vehicles that gets stuck because the wind stopped or the solar stopped. And you're paying now for 3 cars. This is exactly what's going on with our electric grid, is we're paying for full-time power we already have. And the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration, are trying to close down all the coal-powered plants in the United States and make it wildly expensive with unproven, untested carbon capture natural gas plants that will require 20% more energy. So we're going to have to pay more and put more energy in natural gas if the carbon capture actually works at all. And those are only going to add more cost to our electric grid. And then what happens is because the full-time power costs more because we're using it more part-time because it's being displaced by wind and solar, we're using it more part-time, so the per unit cost of electricity goes up, and then wind and solar can get paid more. So our electric bills just keep going up and up and up and up. It's nutty world, but yet they keep telling us something that isn't true.
Well, in my home province of Alberta, within the past 10 years, we've shut down all of our coal plants, and we're selling massive amounts of coal to China. As you say, Alberta is sitting on the 4th largest oil reserves in the entire world. We have the ability to be energy independent, as does the United States if they make the right decisions. The question is, why are all of these wrong decisions being made? Why and who? Why is this being done, and who is driving up the cost of energy for everyone? And what do you think is the ultimate end game here?
Well, there's a variety of different aspects and peoples who are helping with the climate and energy lies and scam. We've created a multi-trillion-dollar international green industrial machine, green industrial complex that has spent a lot of money. The media outlets have gotten literally tens of millions of dollars to promote climate change and the climate change agenda, to work it into all kinds of different stories. So they proudly take tens of millions of dollars to propagandize us and spin what is actually the truth. So there's a green grift going on. Those subsidies are necessary for those companies, or wind and solar would die on the vine. And they're also doing it, gives them purpose. So you have people who believe it as a religion, can't see any other facts, get angry with you if you give them facts like I'm providing, and just don't want to know any of the truth because it gives their life, because they've given up real religion. This is just Frank Lasee's opinion, and it's in the book. They've given up real religions of belief in God and a greater power over all of us in favor of feeling good about saving the world from the climate, but the world doesn't need saving from the climate. Then you have the international globalists, the UN. What better to make more power for the UN, and they're seeking it. Their latest document that they adopted on a voice vote, a no vote, because somebody was supposed to object, but no one did, says that they're going to use the climate agenda and that they need to become stronger and more powerful so that they can impose their will on all of the nations and the people in them under the auspices of the UN. So a global climate problem needs a global climate solution, and the UN and the World Economic Forum, WEF, are here to provide it for us. The WEF is working on major multinational corporations to do it to us without our knowledge at all. And they are doing all kinds of woke lefty things besides bad energy policy, all in the name of climate. So there's leftist politicians in the United States are using it in cooperation and in use of their mainstream media as a propaganda arm of the Democrat Party. And they are using this, and Biden is using, and Harris will even be worse, is using, and it's on his website, this is right from him, all of the government approach. They have produced hundreds, if not thousands, of regulations on virtually everything we have that aren't going to take effect for a few years. But when people go to replace their hot water heater that lasts 10 to 15 years and find out instead of less than $1,000 to replace it, it's going to cost them $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 to buy a heat pump water heater, they're going to be unhappy.
Mhm.
Even made our dishwashers in the United States that take 2.5 hours to clean, and sometimes you have to run them through again, and you have to wash everything before you put them in there. Even worse. And all in the name of climate. So it gives them a reason to meddle in every single aspect of our lives. And that's one big part of this is the control aspect of it. It also helps communist China. The non-government organizations like Greenpeace and others, I believe, have gotten hundreds of millions of dollars from China to foment this because it benefits China and harms the United States. And it's an expensive policy that we have. And now they're after the food supply as well around the
Mhm.
world. And again, you need a reliable, affordable food, reliable, affordable energy for prosperity and modern lives.
Mhm. Of course, China has a dreadful history in the 20th century of imposing government-led famines, the sort of rationed abundance, which seems to be part of the globalist message. But another aspect that you talk about in your book that is really important here is not only propaganda but censorship. So one of the pillars of the Western world, Western civilization, is of course freedom of speech. It's being attacked everywhere, and there's an aspect of this that you talk about in your book, and climate and energy lies, expensive, dangerous, and destructive, and that is the climate censorship machine. And you use an example in your book of Chris Martz, who's a young weather historian, climatologist, sort of the other to Greta Thunberg. You want to talk about that and the role of censorship in this?
Yeah, absolutely. And they have to censor us. They have to censor people like me. They have to throttle this back. They have to censor people like Dr. Richard Lindzen, who is a physicist and a climatologist, highly qualified at MIT, one of our premier universities, and Dr. Will Happer of Princeton. They censor them and they make their work unavailable. Google's in on it, by the way, makes it hard to find these alternative points of view. The UN and Google are partnering to give us only the UN version of the facts, and they're doing this on purpose because when people find out and they get any facts that are disputing the narrative, their support for these crazy policies drops dramatically.
Mm.
And polling has shown in the United States that people will say, yeah, the government should do something about climate change. And no, I don't want to pay more than $20 a month. And they'd be surprised that they're already paying thousands of dollars a month indirectly through various mechanisms that they don't even realize for the climate and the climate agenda. So people don't want to pay for it. And they've been propagandized to say, yeah, you should. Earlier, I think I mentioned that I was disappeared from, kind of like the Nazis do, but literally my profile was disappeared. So was Greg Wrightstone, the executive director of the CO2 Coalition, great source for
Mhm.
factual climate information, CO2
Mhm. I
information.
have read his stuff. It's great.
It's very good. He's got some very good books out there. I'm friends with Greg. We're allies in this fight. We're the little Davids fighting the green blob, the green Goliath. And also Facebook and others throttle it back. They're openly now. Kamala Harris is talking about it, and the Democrat machine in Washington to close down X. When Elon Musk bought it, they stopped throttling back these messages. And a lot of the truth is getting out there. Chris Martz with an MARTZ is a great person to follow, gives factual
Mhm.
information, real facts. But they are censoring us. They throttle it back on Facebook or make it hard to find or disappear it. They put in their fact checkers, which really means we just don't like what you're saying. And they're doing this all over the place because when you learn the facts, and you get any of them, like it was warmer in Greenland when the Vikings settled there from the medieval warm period from about 1950 or from 950 to 1350. It was warm there. They had milk cows. There were trees growing. We found tree roots and skeletons in the permafrost. So it froze afterwards. Can't grow barley there like the Vikings did. We have good evidence in many studies with proxies, because that's all you have, that show that the medieval or the Roman warm period 2,000 years ago was real and it was worldwide. That's the other thing that the climate alarmists will say is, oh no, that was just local. It was just Greenland. It wasn't the rest of the world. That's just simply not true. And there are good visual proofs of this. Right now, there are glaciers melting in Norway and in the Alps. And they just recently found a Roman fort built up in the Alps on an important crossroads that's been under ice for 2,000 years. Of course, the
Really?
article is talking
Wow.
about how the glaciers have melted. Oh my goodness. But the fact is they built a fort when it was much warmer, and it's been under ice for 2,000 years. It was warmer back then.
Literally frozen in time. You were talking about the hurricanes, and one of the things that you mentioned in your book that I found was really illuminating is, one of the things that people talk about, the climate alarmists say is, oh, there's more hurricanes and tornadoes and more people are being put out of their homes and dying and suffering property damage. But you make the point, and this is a really important one, I don't think many people realize, is that oil, coal, and natural gas, they are used to produce life-saving technologies that are actually vastly reducing the impact in terms of lives and loss of property and so on from hurricanes and other types of serious weather events. So that, in fact, if you look over the past century or so, advances in technology that are directly linked to use of fossil fuels, which create about 6,000 different products, that's primarily responsible for saving lives that otherwise would be lost because of these serious weather events. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I was really shocked to learn this.
Yeah, absolutely. First off, there are not more hurricanes, and there are definitely not more tornadoes. We have less tornadoes, and that makes some sense because if you understand and my book covers this to try to help regular people understand it, but how our weather is formed, and it's really the warm air from the tropics meeting the cold air from the Arctic and Antarctica that causes extreme weather. That mixing of very hot and very cold. And we have less of that because Arctic is less warm than it was, and it's mainly in winter. It's about 6 degrees less cold in winter than it used to be. Oh my goodness, instead of 40 below, it's 34 below zero. I mean, really. And Antarctica has not, very hard to find this information, but Antarctica has not warmed in 70 years that we're keeping records. But if you Google Antarctica, you would think the whole continent, which is almost the size of North America, is melting because there are 138 undersea volcanoes warming the western part and the Thwaites Glacier, the Doomsday Glacier they claim, from underneath. It's warming the water underneath, nothing to do with CO2 in the atmosphere at all. But they continue to tell us these various lies to push the agenda. And I got off point a little bit on that, and you were asking me about?
I was asking about the life-saving technologies that are actually linked to the use of fossil fuels and technology.
Well, it is amazing, and I just recently wrote an op-ed that points to companies that are using plastics and even metals come through the process of using coal and natural gas to make them, and a lot of electricity, which is a secondary form of energy. You have to make electricity from something else, and they were life-saving. They put them around hospitals in Florida to stop the floods from coming in. We have plastics that keep our food supply safe, and it gives it a lot more shelf life. So we have a whole bunch of products, as you mentioned, 6,000, but everyday products of all sorts are made with fossil fuels, and those would go away if you actually ended fossil fuels. So a big aspect is they provided in worldwide deaths from climate. And all events have dropped dramatically, literally by 90 to 95%. Less people are dying today. And that's in numbers. And we have 8 billion people in the world, 8 billion. And the other aspect is when a hurricane hits Florida today, or North Carolina today, versus 50 or 60 or 100 years ago, there's so much more to lose. In my book, there's a picture of a 70-year-old picture of Miami when it was almost empty. And today you have billions of dollars worth of people, their homes, and there's so much more to lose. So now today, if a house gets lost to a weather event, we lose so much more. We have computers and cell phones and TVs and a lot more in a home, as well as a lot more homes and a lot more people than we had just a few years ago. So they'll often cook the books that way. Rather than looking at weather losses as a percent of the GDP, the gross domestic product, or all the value of everything, when you look at them in those contexts, our weather losses are going down, not up. And that's because we're building houses better to withstand hurricanes and to withstand earthquakes and to withstand floods. And we do things, and I recommend this, that we adapt to our changing climate like we did after the hurricane that struck New Orleans a few years ago and the dikes failed. They built better dikes. This
Right.
puts people to work, and this protects people from the next hurricane, rather than that climate lie that somehow if we had less CO2, we wouldn't have hurricanes. We will have hurricanes, period. They're going to keep coming no matter what we do.
Hmm. You make the point in your book, Frank, that there are no low energy rich countries, and that really what's going on here is that the climate alarmists are attacking our energy and food supply with climate regulations and policies, and they're after our wealth. They're after the Western way of life. Now, Donald Trump, his policies are very different. He wants to make America great again, and part of that is to awaken this economic engine, a huge part of which is energy production. So, you want to talk about this sort of climate alarmism in the context of the presidential election?
Yeah, there are no low energy wealthy countries. Without energy, life for humans really sucks. It's really hard. There's just no way about it. Try to go a day without electricity and just see how it all works. Without energy, you really can't. So countries that have more energy do a lot better. There's a great movie. You can get it for free on YouTube. It's by Robert Bryce. It's called Juice, and it examines electricity, juice, around the world. And he goes and meets with people in India. And it's a really great little vignette story of a woman who is a tailor who uses a foot pump, a sewing machine, and saves literally a year of wages. So imagine having to save a year of your wages. It would take you several years to buy a sewing machine that was going to 5x her output. She was going to be able to do 5 times more work with an electric sewing machine. She got it. She finally got it. And their electricity is so spotty that it doesn't work most of the time. She can't even use this that she spent her investments on to up her productivity. Now, if she and her neighbors could all up their productivity, they would all be far better off. So that's absolutely true. And Trump recognizes the fact that if we have abundant energy, the cost of everything will come down. One part of our inflation problem in the United States is the ever-increasing government spending, and Biden and Harris are at $3 trillion a year, 10% more a year they're adding to our national debt. And Trump understands that, and then also we have energy inflation, because as energy costs more, we have to pay money for that, and energy is baked into everything that we do. Any food that you eat has to be grown, it has to be processed, it has to be transported, it has to be cooled, chilled, and brought to you. And all of those things take energy. So all of the incremental energy cost increases get built into everything we buy. And Trump understands this, and the left does not, or if they do understand it, they're part of the agenda. They're part of the agenda and part of those climate lies. And the fact is that, and John Kerry, the climate czar, I don't think he misspoke himself. He spoke the truth. He often doesn't, but he said that if the United States went to net zero, it wouldn't make any real difference to the temperature at all, because China and India are producing so much real pollutions and CO2 emissions that what we do is immaterial. What Canada does is completely immaterial, no matter what you do. But China produces more real pollution and CO2 emissions than all industrial nations combined. And China and India are building hundreds of coal plants right now because they still have hundreds of millions of people who are underserved by electricity, and they want to provide it to them so they can get better lives. And between the two of them, they have a third of the world's population, 1.4 billion people each. And then when you look at it and you say, well, China is producing more CO2 emissions than all of the economically developed countries in the world, industrial nations of the world. And then all of those other nations that aren't industrial and aren't China produce more. And they're mainly, you have 2 billion people who are burning wood and dung for fuel. Think of that for the life that you have, to be a subsistence farmer and have to burn wood and dung, how hard that is in the lungs of the mothers, usually the mothers who are cooking over it and living over it every day. And these policies aren't going to work for us, and doing it alone isn't going to work for us. Forcing them to stop building coal plants that last 50 to 75 years isn't possible. And why are they building coal? Because it's reliable, it's cheap, it's abundant. And the lowest cost form of electricity is actually coal plants, once they've been paid off, once the capital cost, the $1 billion it costs to build one, is paid off and you're just buying coal for it, it becomes very low cost. So they're building a low cost, high energy economies while we're trying to go in the opposite direction.
Mr. Trump seems to understand very clearly that all of this green climate agenda, that China is behind it, and that China has a very clear interest in destroying or ending U.S. world hegemony. And of course, this is nothing good, not only for the United States, but also for the rest of the quote unquote free world, because let's face it, we're all sort of standing behind the broad shoulders of the United States in this regard. And a world that is dominated by China is not going to look good for anybody who's accustomed to living in the West. But in addition to talking about these problems, one of the refreshing things about your book, and also on your website, the In Energy and Climate website, is that you actually propose some solutions for people, some practical things that people can do in their daily lives, not controlling their carbon footprint, but there are some things that people can do that can really make a difference in their own lives and more broadly in their communities and in their nations. So could you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, rather than wasting our money on attempting to change the future weather and the climate, we should be spending our money, maybe not at all, because we shouldn't be borrowing money and adding to our $35 trillion national debt. But we should be spending money on hardening our environment. We know that we're going to have hurricanes, so Florida, as they rebuild, might want to look at putting their transmission wires underground. You mentioned earlier all the solar panels that are ripped up because of the hurricane, and we should be doing things that actually make a real world difference, like not rebuilding in floodplains, managing flood waters runoff. And by the way, the IPCC, that's the UN Interpanel Government on Climate Change, whose sole purpose is to prove man-made CO2 driven climate change. It isn't to discover how our climate system works and honestly report that. It's designed, and its mission is to prove and propagandize on behalf of man-made climate change. And they point out that 88% of the world, and this is covered in the book, 88% of the world has no trend whatsoever in floods or in droughts. And the 12% that does have trends, it's very mixed. Some places are getting more and some places are getting less of both. So we need to find ways to take our money and our energies and put them into things that do well for us and advance mankind. The other is moving those 2 billion people off of wood and dung and onto propane would do so much wonders for the environment, and it would greatly reduce CO2 carbon emissions, as if that's really important. But we're not doing any of those sort of things. And in fact, we're telling them, like South Africa, is just wait for wind and solar, build a lot more wind and solar. And they have let their coal plants go into great disrepair, and many of them have closed down. Now they have blackouts for half the day, 12 hours a day throughout all of South Africa. They are having blackouts, which is wrecking their economy. Crime is going through the roof, because what happens with alarm systems and everything else when you don't have electricity is it makes you very vulnerable, and people can't get ahead, like that story of the woman in Juice in India who wanted to get ahead in her life. And we should be helping those poorer countries get ahead in life. And we should actually be fostering, rather than democracy that Bush put us on years ago, we should be fostering capitalism and the components that are really necessary, which are rule of law, rule of private contracts, rule of private property, a legal system that works, low crime. All of those sort of things go into economic prosperity and the welfare of people's lives. And we're literally spending trillions of dollars trying to stop the weather from changing, when in fact doubling or tripling CO2 in the atmosphere, which will take 200 years to double, by the way, would be very good for the planet. It would be a greener planet. More warmth is actually good, several degrees, and warmer yet would be very good for the world. There are no downsides to it as they claim there are. There are no tipping points as they claim there are. And historically, we know that weather and climate have changed dramatically of the Earth's free will from time to time, and we have no control over that.
Fascinating discussion. Those of you who have not yet picked up this book, you really must. It's called Climate, Energy, and Lies. The author is Frank Lasee. He's been our guest today. Very illuminating discussion. So grateful for it. This book has received rave reviews. One of them is from a lady named Stephanie Perucci, who says this is the most important book every global citizen should read, and possibly the most important book I've published in my 22-year career. She's the CEO of the publishing company that has published this book. This book is described as across the modern world, we're being told that the climate heating up, creating a climate crisis. This well-funded propaganda, commonly called climate alarmism, is founded in lies. And we've been talking about this with the author today. These climate energy lies will impoverish communities, states, and entire nations, robbing citizens of their freedoms. And this is already happening, as we've been talking about today. So the book talks about it debunks a lot of these lies that we're being told, explains why they're being told, and also reveals the end game. And I think most refreshingly, it also provides us with some guidance about things that we can do to make a difference. Because part of the problem with climate change is it's designed to make us feel totally helpless, as though we're just part of the problem. There's nothing we can do to make it better other than, this ridiculous, carbon footprint nonsense. One other book I wanted to mention before I turn to our guest and ask him for a suggestion or two is called Climate and Energy, The Case for Realism. This is a book that was published earlier this year. It is written by Calvin Beisner. And this book, the description is that the attempted cures for climate change are generally worse than the disease, as Frank has been talking about today, especially for the poor. And in this book, experts in all the fields related to climate change explain for lay people like us what we know about climate change and evaluate from a Christian perspective the proposed responses. So I thought that would be an interesting companion piece to Frank's book. So Frank, turning to you now, apart from your own book, are there any other books that you would recommend or sources of information that you would recommend to our viewers and listeners that might enhance their understanding of this topic, the topic of your book, and also some of the things you've been talking about with us today?
Yeah, there are a variety of very good books and authors in this area. The website CO2 Coalition has a lot of good information on it. The books by Greg Wrightstone, their executive director, are Inconvenient Facts, is a really good book. It lays out various, sets the record straight on many of the climate lies that we're told by the propaganda media. Those are a couple different sources. And what are the other books? I really like some books, but they're hard to come by Craig Itzo. There's a father and son scientists on the many, many benefits of CO2 and how it makes plants grow so much better. Virtually all plants. That's why worldwide crop yields are up everywhere. You can find that information on Our World Data. Just look at crop yields, crop harvests. And the facts are that things are getting better for humans, getting better for the planet. And when we do things like help people use propane instead of cutting down forests, those forests regrow, so it's very good for the natural habitat. In fact, mammals of all sorts are making huge comebacks, contrary to what they're telling us about extinctions are going up. They are not. That's covered in the book as well. A lot of them happened during the 1600s when Europeans took rats and snakes and got them into islands around the world that decimated and ruined the local environment. They outcompeted the native species that were there. So there are a lot of and Steve Gorham has some various books. Steve Gorham has books for sale as well on the energy and the craziness of the whole energy policy that is coming out. We should fear climate policy. We should not fear climate change. We should welcome warmth. We should welcome more CO2. They're good for the world, not bad for the world, as we're being told.
Well, thank you so much. That's a great way to end off. We want to thank you so much for spending this time with us to talk about such an important topic, and also to talk about your book. I've read it. It's excellent. I highly recommend it, and we want to wish you much continued success with the book. I hope it's a bestseller and that you'll write more. And I want to thank you so much for being our special guest here today on Gray Matter, Frank. It's been our great pleasure to have you on the program.
You are welcome, and I thank you as well. And leave a review on Amazon. I appreciate the kind words, and more people need to read it and think about it. And this is just so important for all of us, because without reliable, affordable energy and without reliable, affordable food, we really are lost, and our children and grandchildren's future prosperity will be severely negatively impacted. And we could do so much more good things in the world than we are now, with the money that we're wasting on sending to China. And it just is. There's so much more that we could unpack with all this, because they are big topics. But it's important that people start to get an understanding of it. This issue isn't going away. The globalists, the leftists are using it. The media are their allies. And there's a lot of your money that you are paying that you don't even know, that's harming your lifestyle and our prosperity, all on behalf of climate change. So I leave you again with fear climate policies, not climate change.
Yeah, well said. And it's important to remember that when God created the earth, he told us to go forth and be fruitful and multiply. He created a planet of abundancy, not of scarcity. And I think that's an important message that comes through loud and clear in your book. So thanks again, Frank. I really appreciate this time with you.
You're welcome. And thanks for everyone for watching.